I just got out of theaters from seeing the Michael biopic on the big screen, and we have a lot to discuss when it comes to this film, guys, because it's highly anticipated. The critics seem to hate it, the audience seems to love it. Which side do I fall on? Well, let's discuss this film. Let's go ahead and get into this movie review. Let's go. Michael is a musical biopic directed by Antoine Fuqua, and inside of this film we see the cinematic portrayal of the life and legacy of one of the most influential artists the world has ever known. The film tells the story of Michael Jackson's life beyond the music, tracing his journey from the discovery of his extraordinary talent as the lead of the Jackson 5 to the visionary artist whose creative ambition fueled a relentless pursuit to become the biggest entertainer in the world. So as you heard there, this movie pretty much covers Michael Jackson's life from the point of his start in the Jackson 5, with his father heavily pushing his boys to become these world-class entertainers, all the way up into about 1988 after the release of Michael Jackson's Bad album, and we essentially end at that point in his life. So this is, a part one story due to the fact that Michael Jackson's life and career and achievements were so long and spanned across multiple decades, so there's so much to cover. You can't squeeze it all into a 2-hour 7-minute movie. So I am glad that they took this route when it came to this film. But with that being said, guys, I couldn't be more excited to talk about this film. Okay, I've been covering the release of this movie on the channel leading up to this, and the day has finally come. All right, I got to see this movie at an early showing, and it was a fantastic theatrical experience. But let's go ahead and start with my positives for the Michael biopic. And for my first positive with this film, we are going to discuss the cast of this movie, because that is such a main highlight here. And more specifically, we have to talk about Jafaar Jackson and his performance as his late uncle Michael. Now, if you didn't already know, yes, it is Michael Jackson's nephew that is playing this role, that is playing the role of Michael Jackson throughout this movie. Now, when it comes to his performance as Michael, you could just feel that this was meant for him. You could just feel that Michael is in his blood. And as a family member on the press tour for this film said, he didn't just act as Michael inside this movie, he became Michael. And you feel that a lot throughout your viewing experience with this movie, because in so many different scenes, Jafaar Jackson embodies everything that Michael Jackson was, and he's almost unrecognizable, and you just fully believe that you are watching the real Michael Jackson on the big screen throughout so many different moments inside of this movie. Now, not only does he resemble Michael very heavily, but it's also in the body language, in the performance, in the way he uses his voice and projects his voice throughout this film, how soft-spoken he was, similar to the real Michael. And then also when it comes to the dancing and the singing, how close his voice actually manages to get, and how accurate his dance choreography is to the real Michael Jackson, and all of the footage that we have of the real Michael Jackson. It's magnificent what Jafaar Jackson was able to achieve with this movie and with this performance. And I think everyone who even doesn't like this film for whatever reason will come out of this movie saying that Jafaar Jackson did an excellent job here. It really can't be disputed after watching this movie. Now, he's not the only highlight when it comes to the cast. This movie is chock full of amazing cast members, and who I think comes second to Jafaar Jackson in terms of the performance here was Colman Domingo, playing Joe Jackson, aka Michael Jackson's father. Now, if you know anything about the history of Michael Jackson and his story and his upbringing and all of the way that his brothers were treated throughout their childhood, you would know that abuse was very present inside of Michael's life and inside of the entire Jackson family's life from Joe Jackson. Okay, and I love that this movie did not hold back when it came to that. All right, they fully showed the violence that was present and the abuse and the pressure that was put onto these children from Joe Jackson to become these huge mega stars. So I appreciate that the movie didn't hold back in that aspect, and we'll touch more on that later. But let's go more into Colman Domingo's performance here, because the way that he portrayed Joe Jackson, he came across like an old school pimp. That was kind of like the swagger that he had about him inside of this movie, and I really loved his take on Joe Jackson, and just how it came across. Like, this is a man that definitely cares about his family, definitely cares about his children, wants his children to do great things, but at the same time, he's maybe not going about it the correct or the moral way to get them to that point. And they really address the flaws in Joe Jackson's character, almost to the point that they villainize him a lot throughout this movie. He's almost the villain inside of this movie, okay? He's like our antagonist here, which I thought was an interesting perspective, because of course this movie takes place from Michael's perspective, and I guess from Michael's perspective that would be the case. Now, after watching Domingo's performance, I can honestly see him getting some type of award for, you know, the supportive cast or something like that. Now let's go ahead and move on to other highlights that we have with the cast, and this will be the final highlight that I'll talk about, and that is Nia Long portraying Michael's mother, Katherine Jackson. And we could talk about resemblance similar to Jafaar Jackson with Michael, how close Nia Long resembles Katherine Jackson. When you go back and look at images of these two put side to side and go look at old photos of Katherine, they look damn near identical. It's very impressive that they managed to find such an amazing actress to portray her that looks so close like her. And then again, the performance is very strong too. You really feel that motherly love come out for her son Michael, and you know, a lot throughout this movie she is the protective force, kind of protecting him from his father Joe Jackson, and really from the entire world, and creating this safe space for Michael to grow up in. And I thought that was just a great way to display her character throughout this film. Now, I know I said that would be the last cast member that we talk about, but I don't want to leave out Miles Teller, because he also does a great job inside of this film as John Bronca. He kind of plays, you know, this manager role for Michael Jackson and really goes to bat for him a lot throughout this movie, and I appreciated what Miles Teller brought to this film also. Now let's move on to another positive that I had with this film, and that would be the costume design. Okay, because when it comes to the costume design inside of this film, it was so accurate. It was a lot of the time a one-to-one recreation of a lot of Michael Jackson's iconic outfits that he's worn throughout history, and that you can go back and look at music videos, photos, different things like that. They got the outfit design perfectly, because fashion was a big part of Michael Jackson's life and his artistic expression and the way, you know, he wanted to present himself to the world, and they got that part so accurate. I couldn't be more happy with the costume design here, and it definitely ended up being one of the stronger points inside of this film. Now let's move on to another positive that I had with the Michael biopic, and that would be the soundtrack. Okay, this is the greatest soundtrack in any film ever released, easily, because you have Michael Jackson's music, the king of pop. You get to use his soundtrack throughout this entire movie, a lot of the most iconic songs in history ever. All right, and they're able to use it inside of this film. You get to see the making process for them, the creative process, the studio process, and that was all brilliant. I love how they showcase that Michael just could not stop dancing as he's trying to record these records, but of course that's going to have impact into how the final recording turns out. So they're constantly telling him, listen, keep your feet still, stop moving so much, and he is trying his hardest. I thought that was just a brilliant display there. And yeah, greatest soundtrack in movie history, easily. And you don't get to hear all his songs from this time period throughout his life that this movie is showcasing, but the ones that they do select, I think they did a great job with it. They picked a lot of the most iconic ones, and it fit really well inside of this film. Now let's go ahead and move on to another positive that I have with this movie. My next positive would have to be that they addressed the hard moments throughout Michael's life. And we spoke on this a little bit when I talked about Joe Jackson and Michael Jackson's upbringing. But yes, to talk more on that topic, Michael, again, was abused constantly throughout his childhood, and they put it on the screen. They display it to you. All right, maybe it wasn't as drastic as it was in real life when they show it in this movie, but they go pretty far with it, and they don't hold back on it for the most part. And to address the other hard moments that they go over inside of Michael's life, okay, and by the way, this is a biopic. All right, this is all like just historical facts about him. If you've been a fan of Michael Jackson, you know everything I'm about to discuss, so you can't really call these spoilers. And we're gonna have to talk about things that this movie talked about, okay? Just a warning there. But to go over more about what they address inside of this film, they have a scene about Michael Jackson's nose job. Of course, if you go back and look at any picture of Michael Jackson, it's very clear that he had a nose job throughout his life. You know, a lot of that probably came from like self-conscious issues, things like that. You know, the world was very hard on Black people during that time, and not to say that they aren't now, but things have clearly eased up. And because of that, and maybe even because of, some words that Joe Jackson has said to Michael as he was younger, Michael went off and got a nose job to fix his self-image issues. And this movie does not hold back on that. All right, we get a full scene displaying that, and I love that. I love that it addressed it. I wasn't sure if they were going to talk about it or go over that point, but they did, and they do go into detail, and they do show how almost shameful he was about it afterwards, yet happy at the same time because he's living in this self-image that he wanted to create for himself. And it's just, a very complicated area to address when it comes to Michael Jackson, and I think they did it in a very tasteful way inside of this movie. And also, to discuss other hard moments throughout Michael's life that this movie touched on, it goes over the vitiligo. And if you don't know exactly what vitiligo is, it pretty much destroys the melanin inside your skin pigmentation, which basically, made his skin change to a completely different color. Now, a lot of people thought, is he skin bleaching? Is he doing this? Is he doing that? No, he had a skin disorder, and this film goes into that. It addresses it. You could see the effects starting to appear. Again, it wasn't full blown by 87 by the time, this movie is written up into, but it is present throughout this film. And it's just yet another thing that I'm glad that they addressed when it came to the hardships inside Michael Jackson's life. Now let's move into my final positive when it comes to the Michael film. And that final positive would have to be that this film shows Michael's character. All right, it shows who he was as a person when the cameras weren't on him, behind closed doors. You get to see his interactions with different people that were going through things inside of their life, and just how he took time out of his own, life of being the most famous person on earth to go interact with and have a human connection in a one-on-one with, a cancer patient or someone else who was sick or someone else who suffered, a burn victim, for example. And just so many other different little small moments like that showed, Michael's heart and his character and what he truly cared about and how he cared about people and about humanity, and not just that, about animals. All right, you get to see his love of animals displayed thoroughly throughout this entire film. Michael was known for having all of these extravagant animals, giraffes, llamas, his famous monkey Bubbles, for example. You get to see all of that on display here, and I love that they went into that part of his character and that they addressed that here. Again, it's another part of this film that I didn't really expect. I didn't know that they were going to go into, and I'm glad that they did to the extent that they did, because it was a big part of his character. And we spoke about it a little before. They showcased his flaws, some of the self-conscious issues that he may have had growing up, but also they showcase his belief in himself. All right, they go over like his manifestation work and him with his positive affirmations towards himself and him speaking life into himself and him, constantly saying that he wants to have the biggest selling album in the world, which he eventually ended up having. And I love that all of this was on display. I love that they addressed his character, a part of Michael Jackson that a lot of people didn't get to see, but his family got to see. And I thought that was an important element here that they showed throughout this movie. Now, with that being said, guys, of course, no movie is perfect, so let's go ahead and get into my negatives with the Michael biopic. And for my first negative with this film, it would have to be the runtime. All right, because by the end of this film, once those credits hit, once those credits roll, it leaves you wanting more. It's almost like a wait, that's it type of moment. Once the lights come up, you're like, wait, there's no way it's over. I was enjoying the ride, I was getting into it. And yeah, 2 hours, 7 minutes. It's very hard, as I stated before, to shove Michael Jackson's life into a movie. So I understand why apparently this is going to be a part one of, 2 different parts here. There's going to be a sequel, which we definitely need. But, you miss out on definitely a lot of different moments that happen throughout this time period in Michael's life that are iconic moments that the movie just straight up glosses over or doesn't address or doesn't even, leave a hint at. And there's even actors coming out saying they got their scenes cut. For instance, Diana Ross and Michael Jackson, it never goes into that territory. It never even hints at it or even mentions it. And there's a lot of other little things like that that they leave out here. And I think that's due to the runtime. Okay, it definitely leaves you wanting more by the end of the movie. And honestly, this felt like it needed to be more like a 2 hour, 30 minute to a 3 hour film. And I would have loved it, because what we got here was amazing. So, you know, a little more there and I would have appreciated it, but I am happy with what we got here. And to move into, you know, my final negative with this film, it would have to be that it falls into a lot of the different tropes that biopic movies tend to have, and that's the fact that it feels like a highlight reel at times. You know, throughout some of the moments here, it does feel a bit surface level. It does feel like, let's go a little bit deeper there and really understand what you're trying to say here. And a lot of the time you are just jumping from big highlight moment to big highlight moment to big highlight moment inside of this movie. Now, that's outside of the times that we address inside of the positive section, where it does stop and take a break and flesh out, you know, some of the more personal moments. But I just wish we got a little bit more here. I think a 3-hour film would have been perfectly fine, considering all of the achievements that Michael Jackson achieved throughout his life and across multiple decades here. So with that being said, that would be my negatives that I had with this film. Now let's move over into my overall review for the Michael movie. Look guys, overall this was an amazing theatrical experience. Okay, I would highly recommend you go out and see this movie. And the reason for that is all of the reasons that we addressed in the positive section of this video. All right, the costume design, the cast, the performances here, Jafaar Jackson resembling and blending and becoming Michael Jackson, getting to feel like you're sitting front row at a Michael Jackson concert, which a lot of us will never even have the chance to experience throughout our entire life. So that part felt really special there. Getting to see all of these different iconic moments portrayed on the big screen in glorious fashion, all the way from the Jackson 5 to Thriller to the Bad album. That was brilliant. It was amazing, and I loved seeing this movie. The soundtrack is brilliant. Of course it's going to be. It's a Michael Jackson movie, so you get to use his music. And then the performance, you know, from Joe Jackson, so strong. Second strongest to Jafaar Jackson inside this movie. And just how honest and real this film was with the true character of Michael Jackson, and going into those hard moments throughout his life and addressing some of those self-conscious issues he may or may not have had. I thought all of that was brilliant. Okay, so with that being said, guys, if I had to rate this film, I would give the Michael biopic a 9 out of 10. It gets the 9 out of 10. I think this was an amazing theatrical experience. I would highly recommend you support this film at the box office and that you see this in all of its glory on the big screen, okay? Just how it deserves to be seen, and I can't wait for the sequel. All right, can't wait for the second movie. It's going to be magnificent just as this one was. And now that we're on the backside of this video, I do want to leave you with the message, and I do want to say that shame to all of the critics out there who've seen this movie early and tried to belittle it, tried to step all over its release, tried to bring up all of these negative things throughout Michael's life that have already been addressed, you know, decades ago and have already been proven false. And the fact that, you know, they've lent themselves to this evil industry that tried to tear him down because of everything that he's accomplished and because of his ownership in these different record labels and how much he owned of Sony Records, for example. You know, they tried to make Michael a caricature. They tried to destroy his image. They tried to come for his character in the worst way possible. And you all know what I'm talking about. So the fact that, you know, it's been this many decades since the man has passed and we're still trying to do this, it's disgusting. And I'm glad that the audience and the fans are seeing through that. I'm glad that, you know, throughout all of the critics bashing and doing whatever they're doing, that the fans came out and said, no, this movie is great. We're still going to see this movie. You're not going to stop us. We're going to give a real opinion and a real take on this film, just as we did here today on Demigod ENT. I gave you guys a real honest review for this movie, just as was always intended. All right, and I couldn't be more happy that Michael's family now has control over his image and over his character, and they get say so in signing off on what gets put in and what doesn't get put into this film. All right, and they wrote off on all of the nonsense that shouldn't have been inside this movie and that was cut out of this film. And apparently they had to reshoot the whole third act because the family didn't agree with the way it was done. And the third act in this movie is amazing. So yeah, they tried to show him, you know, he's not bigger than the program, and that no artist is bigger than the program, and that no matter how famous and how big or how talented he was, that they can crush him just as they do everybody else. And that's not the case anymore. You can't just use the media to belittle and to bash and to do whatever you want to do to somebody anymore. Okay, everyone has a voice thanks to the internet, thanks to y'all. And so with that being said, guys, that was the Michael biopic review. Alright, I had an amazing experience. I recommend you go see it. Those are my thoughts on this film. Let me know your thoughts on this film down in the comment section down below. If you don't know what we do here on Domingo, we do film, TV, and pop culture based content. So if you're interested in this type of content, you're in the right place. Hit subscribe, hit the like button if you enjoyed this video. I'll catch you in the next one, guys. Peace.